Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Before we start, before we get into the main subject of this evening, which is Pinot Noir and the wines of Burgundy, I do want to address the question that was asked for me this yesterday, and which I put in this morning's letter. Does wine really improve with aging in the bottle? Oh, I need to mute. I need to mute all.
Sí, pero tú no quieres, entonces no me hagas el favor.
Well, muting all doesn't work, does it?
Muy mal educado, no te dieron educación jamás.
Porque estoy mal educado. Era tú y fuiste allá, no yo.
Entonces no me hables, por favor.
Porque estoy mal educado.
I'm sorry, Christina, we're trying to keep, there we are. Are we muted now? Thank you. Sorry about that, don't want to be rude, but I'm the boss. Does wine really improve with aging in the bottle? On the one hand, Mark Oldman, the so-called America's wine expert, says that only 2% of wines really improve with aging in your cellar, and that most wines are ready to drink once they are for sale. So don't bother. On the other hand, I read other critics or consumers in Vivino saying about many wines, it was a great wine, but with some more years in the bottle, in the cellar, it would be superb. Who's right? And that was that's a question from Francisco Alviareta, and thank you, Francisco. That's a very good question. And the answer, you know, I'm not copying out. The answer is they're both right. They're both right in the sense that probably 95% or more of wines which are produced today in the 21st century are for immediate consumption. There are some enormously expensive wines, particularly the wines from Bordeaux that we discussed last week, which are high in tannins and which really do need to age. And those are the very expensive wines which are purchased by Harvard University, Oxford University, the Ritz Hotel, and major restaurants around the world. And they are for keeping, and they do benefit from age. For example, last week, we drank a Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and it was only 2 years old. And I remarked that it would benefit from a couple more years of aging. So wines do benefit from being in the bottle. I mean, but most wines are deliberately. Christina, we need to. Yeah. Please. I know you're in Colombia, but please mute. So most wines are you can drink immediately, and they're deliberately made that way. We now live in a society, and I'm not just talking about America, I'm talking about the world of instant gratification, and we want it, and we want it now. However, there are some big wines, particularly those that have a lot of tannins, like the Bordeaux's, which will last for a long time and will benefit. And those wines, apart from being very expensive, they also are very careful about having good quality corks from the cork tree, and the capsule, which is around the neck, should be slightly loose. So when you turn it like this, it does move. That is because the wines are breathing. And when you're keeping them in the cellars at Oxford University or the Ritz Hotel for 20 years, they are slightly evaporating. But at the same time, all the complicated things from the skins, from the tannins, are maturing, and there's chemical processes going on, making them better. But we're talking about very seriously expensive wines in this case. But most of the wines which we are buying today, particularly those of us living in the United States, particularly those of us living in the southern parts of the United States, where we depend on air conditioning, really shouldn't be worried about that. I know many people have wine coolers so that they can store the wines. I don't. I have my little cellar here, but my wife and I keep the house at about 78 degrees, and that's enough. I don't keep wine long enough. I don't have the ability to store wine long enough without drinking it. So therefore it's not an issue for me. However, and next week we will discuss this in great detail, that wine is an investment. And if you're looking at wine as an investment, then yes, it is worth spending the money on making sure that you're storing it properly so that it can creep up in value. But if you're just storing it so that you can drink it, then really I wouldn't worry about it at all. But to answer the question, yes, wines do benefit from aging, but only certain wines and only the really, really good wines. Otherwise, they start turning into vinegar with age. Like gentlemen, you know, some of us grow with age, and others don't. The other thing is that going back to the 19th century, when the whole mystique of and early 20th century mystique of aging wines began, since then we've discovered malolactic fermentation. And I don't want to bore you, but that's like a secondary fermentation. And what it does, it softens. So let's take, for example, one of the Bordeaux that we were discussing last week, Chateau Latour, for example. When you first taste it, when it's just a year or two old, it's really bitter. Those tannins bite into you. And that's why you store it very carefully for 20 years. And the and it gradually, it softens. What we'll be drinking tonight, which we'll come to in just a moment, is Pinot Noirs. They don't have all those tannins. The best way to maybe, my personal explanation of this is when my wife and I lived in France, in the Bordeaux area, and I'm embarrassed, I don't want to embarrass my wife by saying this, but this was half a century ago. Maybe a group of us, 6 different families, friends, we would go and we would buy, after the vendage, we would taste the wines at the winery, and each family would buy a case, 12 bottles each. And then we'd take them home, and one of us would be hosting, and that evening we would the host would open one of his bottles, and we'd taste. Very young, but promising, we should look again. And a year later, somebody else would host a dinner party, and that host would open his or her wine. It's improving. And maybe after 3-4 years, parfait. And that way, between us, we bought maybe 72 bottles, but we were just year by year exploring until we got to the right point where the wine was perfect and ready for drinking. But as I say, that was 40, 50 years ago. We were buying directly from the winery, usually Péchemont, just north of Bergerac, where my daughters were born. And on top of that, we all lived in houses, ancient houses with cellars in France. Our house, for example, was built 900 years ago. It was definitely old, definitely good for storing wines without needing an expensive electric fridge. But today, most of us living here in South Florida. We are all living in the 21st century. Things have changed dramatically. There really is no need for that and no benefit from that. So to answer your question, yes, if you really want to invest in wine, which we'll discuss more next week, then by all means go ahead. But otherwise, there's no point in storing wine. Most wine, 95%, is made for immediate drinking. And the wines which are big wines, expensive wines, let the store, let the hotel, let the restaurant store it for you and then drink it rather than go through. living here in South Florida with air conditioning and power cuts, not worth it in my opinion. So what we want to discuss this evening is Pinot Noir, and I've talked enough. I think now is the time to pour it. This is a Pinot Noir from Northern California, and many of you are wondering, well, if the evening is devoted to the Pinot Noirs of Burgundy, why are we drinking one from Northern California? Good question. And I hope you're all tasting this now. The immediate response to me is, after all the wines we've drunk in the previous 3 classes, which was very strong, all had a lot of tannins in. This is so soft, feminine, if you forgive me. It's very fruity, very soft, very, and this I've just poured it, so this is going to change over the next hour. But completely different, I think, from the previous 3 wines that we've had. And I hope you agree with me there. I will unmute you all halfway through the evening, and you can agree or disagree with me. So this evening we're talking about Pinot Noir. Last week in particular, we talked about the wines of the Rhone, where there were, in fact, I showed you a list of 18 different, oh, is anybody in the, my goodness, 2 people are waiting. Welcome, latecomers, 1 more person waiting. Okay, hopefully we're all in now. As I explained last week, we looked at the Rhone Valley, where there were, at one point I showed you a list of 18 different possible grape varietals that were permitted in the wines. And then we looked at Bordeaux, where it's very, very tight, very disciplined. 6 specific grapes are permitted. And this evening, we're going to Burgundy, and there's only one, for red wines, there's only one grape. That's the Pinot Noir. Let me quote from this wonderful book of mine again to talk about Pinot Noirs. The Pinot Noir grapes are tightly clustered. They're physically very, very small and tight together. They're dark purple, pine cone shaped bunches of fruit, whose name probably refers to the French word for pine and block. In other words, it's like an inverted pine shape, and they're black, Pinot Noir. It's one of the most difficult grapes to grow and to make into fine wine. It's also one of the very best when it's done properly. So I'm going to make a reference here to Sideways, the movie that came out about maybe 10 years ago. As anyone who's seen the movie Sideways will already know, Pinot Noir is a grape that inspires great passion. The acclaimed wine critic Janice Robinson calls Pinot a minx of a vine. The legendary winemaker Andrei Chivkov declared that God made Cabernet Sauvignon, whereas the devil made wine. Other critics, however, offer a completely different perspective. Joel Fleischman of Vanity Fair describes Pinot Noir as the most romantic of wines, with so voluptuous a perfume, so sweet an edge, and so powerful a punch that, like falling in love, they make the blood run hot and the soul wax embarrassingly poetic. Master sommelier Madame Trifon calls Pinot Noir sex in a glass, while Peter Richardson of Onio Style christened it a seductive yet fickle mistress. Robert Parker, who, as you all know, I have mixed feelings about, has said that Pinot Noir, when it's great, Pinot Noir produces the most complex, hedonistic and remarkably thrilling red wine in the world. And then the children's author that we read last week, Roald Dahl, who wrote that short story on taste, which I hope you all enjoyed, he wrote, remember he's a children's author, to drink a Romanée Conté, Pinot Noir, is like having an orgasm in the mouth and the nose at the same time. Well, I can't promise you that this evening, nor do I really want to pursue that metaphor. However, Pinot Noir and Burgundy do represent the soul of France. Don't forget the wines of Bordeaux, even though they're the most probably famous in the world, and they're the ones which travel all over the world, they were developed for the English market, whereas the wines of Burgundy were developed for the French. So to go back to my original question, which I didn't answer, why, if we're talking about French Pinot Noirs this evening, have I encouraged you all to buy Pinot Noir from Northern California? Very good question. Two basic answers. In the first case, to get a decent Pinot Noir from France, decent Burgundy, is quite expensive. And in planning this course, this program, I wanted to try and keep the prices down. I went over the top with a Stag's Leap, $54, but I thought it was worth it for all of the various reasons. It's such a significant bottle. But to do, again, another $50 on a French Pinot Noir, I wasn't happy with. So I went looking for an Oregon, Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. Unfortunately, the day I was purchasing and putting all this together, they were out of Oregon wine, so I picked a Northern Californian, which I'll show you a map in a moment. It's very, very close. So that's what we call the New World. And when we're talking about the French ones, and I want to compare the French ones with the New World, the Californian and Oregon. So let me get you a slide that you'll remember from last week. This was the slide I used last week. And when we were talking about the Northern Rhone. And the significance here is that when we were talking about the Northern Rhone, I said that there were two specific grapes, which were the only two which are allowed. For the red wines, it was Syrah, which the Australians then renamed as Shiraz. And for the white wines, Viognier. Those two wines wouldn't grow, they wouldn't do well in Burgundy if they moved further north, because they need more sun, they need more heat. At the same time, in Burgundy, we have just the two grapes. For the reds, it's Pinot Noir. For the whites, it's Chardonnay. But if we move those down into the Northern Rhone, that wouldn't work. Too much heat. As I think I've explained, I think it was here. Pinot Noir grapes, they have very specific requirements for the growing conditions. They need warm days and cool nights. And if Pinot Noir receives too little heat in the growing season, its wines are thin and pale and pretty watery. And that's why I was unhappy about the possibility of getting a cheap Pinot Noir from France. They are very, very, very disappointing. And if the growing season is too warm, which is what we've got in Southern California, the wines have an overripe, cooked, jammy flavor. And I didn't want to get an unsatisfactory French Pinot Noir for this evening's talk, because that would give entirely the wrong impression. The other thing, while we're looking at this map, is I know it's unfashionable to talk about climate change, and I don't want to get into politics, but as climate change, for those who don't believe it's a Chinese hoax, as the heat moves forward, there might come a time in 10 or 12 years when the Syrah and the Viognier will grow in Burgundy. And the wine growers in Burgundy are very increasingly worried that the heat is making their Pinot Noirs too jammy. They're moving forward. And I think, as I explained in maybe the first class, don't forget, just north of, just where it says Pinot Noir on that map, that's a Champagne area of France. And again, in Champagne, the wine is made from Pinot Noir and Chardonnays. And as I think I mentioned in the first class, the Champagne growers are moving into southern England because the temperatures are moving. So southern England now is warm enough to grow the equivalent of Champagne. So this is a growing problem. I don't need technical problems now. There we go. So we have the same situation. This is the western coast of America. And those of you who, and hopefully most of you have seen Sideways, and I'm not talking mysteriously. Sideways was a movie about a couple of guys in LA, and they went off, and it's a great movie. It's great fun. And they go off into the wine country around Santa Barbara, and one of them is really passionate. He hates Merlot and really loves Pinot Noir. And actually, as a result of that movie, wine growers up in Northern California started ripping up all the vineyards with Merlot and planting Pinot Noir. It had a tremendous effect. In fact, my wife and I watched it late at night, and driving home, we stopped at the first liquor store we could see and went in and bought a bottle of Pinot Noir. It's so enthusiastic. However, the Pinot Noirs from Southern California are really disdained by the French because they're the opposite of what the French Pinot Noirs, the Burgundies, are like. Burgundies are very elegant, they're very austere, they're very fine, whereas the Pinot Noirs from most of California are, well, Robert Parker calls them fruit bombs. Robert Parker is a very, very influential American wine critic, wine writer, and I respect him in many ways, and I share his taste in many ways. I just think he has a bit too much power and influence on people. But one thing he said was, originally, back in the early 60s, Californian wine growers were trying to make Pinot Noirs the way the French did. Parker famously said, if you want to make wine like the French, move to France. We are here in California where there's more sun, the water is more controlled. We can make fruity, more powerful wines. So there's a bit of a philosophy there. So, and again, look at the map. Santa Barbara is 35 degrees north of the equator. That's the same level as Algiers in North Africa. What we're drinking tonight is from Anderson Valley. And what as I mentioned, I wanted to get a Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley in Oregon. That's 45 degrees north. That's on exactly the same latitude as Burgundy. And there's a remarkable relationship between Burgundy and Oregon. The governor of Oregon a few years ago was welcomed in Burgundy for any French winemaker to be, or Frenchman, American to be welcomed and respected in Burgundy. It's quite an achievement in itself. They actually gave him a gold medallion and everything else because they recognized that the wines of Oregon and Northern California, and we'll look at Anderson Valley in just a moment, have the same taste and the same meaning as the wines of Burgundy. And also we're going to see, actually, it's called Joseph Drouhin is one of the oldest wine growers and negociants in Burgundy, and they were so impressed with the wines of Oregon and Northern California. He's moved over and he's bought some vineyards, and they're growing wines both in Oregon and in Burgundy. So here's Anderson Valley, and you can see that it's written right on the border with Oregon, same latitude as Bordeaux, as Burgundy. It's 15 miles long. I will send you a good description of it. I won't bore you with it now, but it's a pretty remote, pretty obscure place. It's just perfect for growing wine. It has the same soil, has the same conditions. What the Pinot Noir likes is early morning sun, heat during the day, and then a lot of cloud cover and coolness at night. And of course, being so close to the Pacific Ocean here in Anderson Valley, they are they're getting all that. So let's look to Burgundy. And where did I put my glass? So that's why we're drinking Edict from Anderson Valley. It's a Pinot Noir. It's got very good nose. It's great fruit flavor. One caution I have is I noticed after I bought it that it's 14.5% alcohol. And on the whole, Pinot Noirs do better, and the French Pinot Noirs are usually much lower, probably 12.5%. The higher alcohol overtakes that elegance that a Pinot Noir usually has. So here's Burgundy. The thing to know about Burgundy, it's the heart of France. And in many ways, to the French, its wines are the soul of France. All through the Middle Ages, the Dukes of Burgundy were much more powerful than the kings of England, the kings of France, the kings of Spain, or the princes of Germany. Burgundy is simply a very, very naturally wealthy place. The poulet de Bresse are big, fluffy, white chickens, and universally recognized as being the tastiest chickens in the world. The Bœuf de Charolais, when you go to Burgundy, the fields are in the farms, the fields are full of these white cows, and the beef it melts in your mouth. It is so delicious. And not many people know this, but my wife and I were originally snail farmers when we lived in the Bordeaux area. And in fact, on my wedding license, it says that I'm named as a Hélici-Culturiste, which is a snail rancher. But in the rest of France, we have just the petit gris, the small snails. Jude and I became pretty expert on them. We went all up and down the west coast of France dealing with them. But there was a certain envy for the snails of Burgundy, les gros blancs, the big white snails of Burgundy. So Burgundy had everything going for it. It was really wealthy. It was centrally located, as you can see from the map. The dukes were certainly powerful. And one of the things the Duke Philippe the Bold in the late 14th century realized was that part of the power of his economy was based on the wines, on the grapes, and it was the Pinot Noir. Now, Pinot Noir, as I pointed out when I read from my book, it's a very difficult grape to grow. It's very, very edgy about the soil conditions and the climate. It's not a big producer. There's not a lot of juice per grape. So the farmers didn't really like it. What they liked was further south. You can see, if you look at the bottom of the map, Beaujolais, the grapes there is the Gamay grape. very juicy, very productive, very easy to grow, very forgiving. So in 1395, the Duke Philippe made it a hanging offense. He actually made it an edict that anybody growing Gamay within the confines of Burgundy would be taken out to his vineyard and hanged. And that would definitely influence the body swinging there would influence his neighbors. So ever since then, the only red grape grown in Burgundy is the Pinot Noir. Another thing notable about Burgundy, well, the tradition of growing vineyards there goes way back to the Romans. And we actually have a letter from Emperor Constantine, 302 AD. Very, very detailed about how clearing out the vine. This is from the emperor himself to the monk, to the centurion in charge of Autun, which is right there in the center of Burgundy, about clearing out, very, very technical, about the roots and I don't know, technical stuff that I don't understand, but they were obsessed with it. And then, of course, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Burgundy was really taken over by, first of all, the Benedictine monks, who kept civilization going, and they obviously needed the wine to produce, to conduct mass. After a while, there was a little bit too much of that going on with the Benedictines. They got a bad reputation. So then the Cistercians came and built their abbeys and monasteries. And probably most of the major abbeys and monasteries through the Middle Ages were here in Burgundy. As a result, because the monks were out there digging and measuring rainfall and recording, and it's probably the most documented part of the world, Burgundy. And every harvest is recorded, all the conditions of the weather, and this works, that doesn't work, etc., all documented. The other thing about Burgundy, it was very stony. I mean, the ground is just very, very stony. Consequently, in order to plant your vines or to do anything else, you have to remove the stones. So they would build walls, and they certainly learned. It's called climat. Just this tiny area here is a certain climat, and it really produces so much better results than over there. So walls, you have to get the stones out of the way. So where do you put them? You build the walls. So and then the area within is called a clos. So that's why a lot of the, as you'll see, the vineyards are called clos de. That's where it comes from. So that's a general background to Burgundy. But to the French, it is the heart of France, and the wines are the real, if you want to understand the French, you have to understand Burgundy. There's still a lot of French people regard the wines of Bordeaux as something for the English and the Americans. Okay, we're going to go through the AOC, Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, again. So any wine grown within that red circle there, and as you can see on the map, you can see Bordeaux we looked at last week, the Rhone Valley we looked at last week. Today we're looking at Burgundy. Any grape, any wine produced in that area can be called Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée Burgundy. Now within Burgundy, the bottom you have the Mâconnais, the green area, then you have the Chalonnais, the blue area, but in the top area of Burgundy, it's called the Côte d'Or, the Gold Coast, if you like. And that's what we're really going to look at this evening. So the northern part of the Côte d'Or is 90% red wines, Pinot Noir. And the southern part, the Côte de Beaune, is 90% Chardonnay, white wines. And you get the odd exception, but that's basically it. Red in the north, white in the south. And we're now going to go into a specific village commune in the Côte de Nuit called Gevrey-Chambertin. So, and I went over this a bit last week, but I've had a few people question me, so let me explain it again. Let's imagine that South Florida was a good wine growing area. Therefore, any wine grown and bottled in South Florida could have on the label Appellation South Florida Contrôlée, just as this one here has Bourgogne, Appellation Bourgogne Contrôlée. Within South Florida, we have certain areas which are better than others or different from others. So, for example, Miami-Dade will make that the equivalent of the Côte de Nuit. And everything, you know, it's narrowed in. But within Miami-Dade, certain cities are better than others. So Coral Gables versus Miami Beach or Hialeah. So with, let's say, Coral Gables, then the Gevrey-Chambertin is the name of the village, just as Coral Gables is the name of the village. So anything grown within the boundaries of that commune will have the right to be called Appellation Coral Gables Contrôlée. Now, as we're narrowing in like this, the rules are getting tighter. It must be, for example, well, in this particular case, obviously Pinot Noir, but also, I was asked a question last week about how many bottles can be produced per acre. That again will be limited, and maybe you know, an Appellation South Florida, there's no limit. You know, as many bottles as you can make during the harvest. Good harvest, you make a lot, and bad harvest, you make a few. Whereas for an Appellation Coral Gables, you'll be limited. You're only allowed to make 600 cases, for example, whether it's a good harvest or not. Then, now this is purely Burgundy. This is how Burgundy is different from Bordeaux. Within Coral Gables, well, let's say there are 100 vineyards in Coral Gables, separate vineyards owned by different people. You have, some of them are elected, and they're called Premier Cru, first growth, and that's posh, that is. So on your label, so let's say it's just Patrick Alexander's vineyard and I'm a sort of a mediocre in Coral Gables. All I can put on my label is Coral Gables Contrôlée. Whereas my wife, who works much harder, she has her Jude's vineyard. She could put Coral Gables Jude, and she's allowed to put the name of her vineyard on the label as well, because she's a Premier Cru. And then there's just one or two, and most villages don't even have this, but there's one or two, there's 33 in the whole of Burgundy, which are called Grand Crus. And if you have a Grand Cru, then you don't even need to mention Coral Gables, because people, or in this case, Gevrey-Chambertin. So if you look at the final one, it's called Le Chambertin, but there's no mention of the commune where it comes from. Because if you don't know where it comes from, you shouldn't be allowed to even drink it. One other thing I did want to mention is, if you look at the one which I've labeled as Miami-Dade, the Côte de Nuit village, there, the producer there is Joseph Droudon. He's one of the, or his family, for generations, been one of the most powerful and respected wine growers and negociants in Burgundy. And they have now bought up and they've moved over to Oregon. It's the Willamette Valley, where they've got a number of, so they're producing Pinot Noirs in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, as well as in Burgundy. And a note here on negociant, I'll come back to it. A negociant is somebody who goes around and buys wine, buys the grapes from the grape growers, and then produces the wine himself and puts his name on the label. And there's about 5 or 6 really well known. For example, you can see two, the first one and the third one Louis Jadot. Just like Joseph Rouen. In other words, they haven't grown it. It's not their vineyards, but they've gone and bought the grapes. And the reason for that, which we'll go into a bit later, is the fact that most of the vineyards because of French inheritance laws, nobody owns the whole vineyard. They only hold a little bit. So if you only own a strip of land here and a strip of land there, you can only bring in so many grapes. That's not enough to open up a winery. It's not enough to bottle your own bottles. So you sell them to the negociant. And then the negociant knows that you are a good farmer, you're producing good grapes, and his reputation, and I've got to say, their reputations go back several generations. We're talking about families which started off in the 16th and 17th century, and they've been making wine ever since. So that's the background to negociants. You get them in Burgundy, you don't get them in Bordeaux. This is the village of Gévry-Chambertin. So the first place here, the Côte de Nuits, in other words, Gévry-Chambertin is the village, but it's surrounded by, this is Coral Gables, but it's surrounded by Miami-Dade, if you like. So this poor chap who's got a vineyard, but he's just outside the walls of the village. So he can't put Gévry-Chambertin on his label. All he can do is say Côte de Nuits. Now this chap, he's inside the commune. So he can put, you can see the pale pink, he can put Gévry-Chambertin, the name of the village, on his label. He can't put his own name, he can't put the name of his vineyard, but he can put Gévry-Chambertin. This is a Premier Cru. So he is allowed to, he or she is allowed to put the name of the vineyard and Gévry-Chambertin, the commune, on the label. And finally, for the Grand Cru, Le Chambertin doesn't even have to mention the name of the village. The other interesting thing to show here in this map is, there's not a, I can see because I've seen the original map. I don't think you can probably see on the screen, but there are contours. So, for example, you know that it's not arbitrary. All the pale pink are lower down, and you know they're flatter. The darker colors are higher up, and they are probably south. Well, they are east facing. Most of the contour is east facing, so it's getting the early morning sun, it's getting the heat of the day, and then it's going to get the cool of the evening. And that's what makes the wines there. So it's not just arbitrary. If you look, there's a definite pattern of where the Premier Cru and the Grand Cru are located. And this, and again, we see the classic sloping shoulders of the Burgundy wine bottle. And that particular bottle comes from, it's a Premier Cru. It's called the Bel Air. So the big letters there are Gévry-Chambertin, because that's really what's going to sell it and put the price up, the fact that it comes from Gévry-Chambertin. But it's also Premier Cru Bel Air. And if you could get close to that map, you'll see that it's that's where that little vineyard is. So here is, as I said, there are 33 Grand Crus in the whole of Burgundy. There's also, how many? 585 Premier Crus. So most of them are Pinot Noirs. Those are the red ones at the top. And the blue ones are Chardonnay from Côte de Beaune, the lower part of the map. And I can't remember them all by name. Here we're focusing in on the Côte de Nuits. As I said, that's the northern part. That's where the red wines are. And again, I'm going to be sending you these PowerPoint slides, so you'll be able to read it a bit in a bit more detail. And the significance between the blue and the red, I've just done different colors, so you can see there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different communes, villages, communes, which have the Grand Crus. And 2 of them are very, very special. That's Gevry-Chambertin, which we've just been looking at. It actually has 9 Grand Crus, quite extraordinary. And the other one, which we're going to look at in a moment, is Vosne-Romane, which has 6. But most villages don't have the Grand Crus. That's why they're so expensive, and we'll look at some of the prices in just a moment. But now I'm going to unmute you, and let's see if we have any questions or comments. Actually, it would appear you're all unmuted. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions, or shall we move on?
Hello. Hey, Patrick.
Yes. Hello.
Alan wants to know how many Grand Crus there are.
33.
Premier Cru.
585, if I remember rightly.
So they're more Premier Crus than Grand Crus? Grand Cru. Oh, Grand Cru is the top,
Yeah.
okay.
There's 33 Grand Crus in the whole of Burgundy, and we only get, well, let me go over that again. Another difference between Burgundy and Bordeaux is, as we saw last week, in Bordeaux, they made a decision that this vineyard in 1855, and with the one exception of Mouton de Rothschild, nothing has changed since then. So all the classification they did in 1855 is the same as it is today, with that one exception. Whereas in Burgundy, they put in this classification of the village, Appellation Village, Appellation Premier Cru, Appellation Grand Cru. They did that in 1865, and every now and again they revise it, you know, based on reputation. And if you think about it, if we as a group here, how many are we now? 30 people. If we were all behind, let's say, Appellation Coral Gables, and you felt that I was slipping behind a bit and drinking too much or not watching after business, I would be harming the reputation of the group. And at that point, there would be a village council, and we would decide, well, Patrick, you know, you're no longer a Premier Cru, you're no longer a Grand Cru. So it does change from time to time, a bit like Michelin stars for restaurants. So the reputation of Burgundy, the classification in Burgundy, is much more democratic and probably much more honest and meaningful than the classification that you have in Bordeaux.
Hi.
Other questions?
Yes, I would love if you could send over a list of Pinot Noirs from France that are affordable and still really amazing to drink.
I would love to have such a list. If anybody can find it, send it to me. That's why we're drinking.
So are they all completely unaffordable? Is that what you're saying?
They are very, very unaffordable. What I'm going to do this evening, in addition to sending you the PowerPoint presentations, I'm also going to send you a couple of videos about Bordeaux. They're short and really, really beautiful. They will make you fall in love. But more importantly, I'm going to send you a Vanity Fair article about a blackmail attempt on one of the vineyards. And it's a wonderful story in itself, but part of its value is explaining the ridiculous costs of good Bordeaux wines. And we're going to look at someone in a moment. And I think that might answer your question. Any other questions before I move on?
I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question, Patrick.
Yes.
I'm a beginner.
We're all beginners.
In terms of wine, which is the best rated, most valuable? I can't think of the term. For example, with beef, we all know Wagyu beef from Japan is, or Kobe beef from Japan is best of the best, right? So in terms of wine, is it true French wine from France, or could it also be from California? Which is the most valuable, best rated, top of the top, creme of the creme?
Well, in a sense, we're going to look at that next week. And you'll see various attempts to, because you just mentioned two things: the most valuable, which could also mean the most expensive or the most delicious. There is no, and in fact, if you remember what I read to you last week, Brillat Savarin, the 18th century French writer, who was asked which are best, Bordeaux or Burgundy, he said, I prefer to carry on checking and before coming to a final decision. And I think that's the answer, is keep testing, keep checking.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to move on now to, because I see that I've
Patrick, it's Mary Lee. I'm sorry, you can't see me. I was traveling. I have a quick question.
Okay.
In my limited experience.
Oh, sorry. Are you there?
Oh, I'm back. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I muted when she was speaking because I didn't want to be rude. So it's Mary Lee. Sorry, you can't see me today. Anyway, in my limited experience, when I thought of California wines versus French wines, like a Chardonnay or a Cab or Merlot, it seemed that to get a decent one, let's say for a 20 euro bottle in Paris, was the equivalent of a $40 or $50 American one from California if it was a Chardonnay or a Merlot or a Cab. Yet with Pinot, you're telling me that it's really the other way around and there's a bigger difference in price. Did I hear that correctly?
Not really, and I really don't like getting into price because it gets, we will be talking about it next week, obviously, but price of wines is so complex. There's so many other things involved, and it's all to do with marketing. It's all to do with there's no black and white, and it's also, again, going back to the previous question about what's best. It still comes down to personal taste. Personal taste. I'm now going to
Thank you.
move forward.
Okay. No.
Sorry, I hate being rude like this, but I'm going to
We'll either enter it or enter it next week, depending on which is the most appropriate. I guess I should mute you. Yeah.
okay. And I'm actually hoping that the email I'll be sending you later this evening will answer a few of those questions in a bit more detail. As I mentioned, a lot of stones in Burgundy with which they build walls. One of the videos that I'm sending you later is beautiful, whether it's a drone or whatever, just flying over Burgundy, and you see these walls. They are extraordinary, and it comes from two reasons. One is the rock, the stony ground, so they had to get rid of the stone, so they build the walls. The other thing is the Mistral wind, which howls down through Burgundy and then down the Rhone Valley. So that protects, the walls protect the vines from the wind. And the other thing is that what the monks used to call climat. In other words, a specific area, like this room that I'm standing in is really good for, and that room over there has a different sort of taste. So they called all of these climats, and they separated them all by walls as a way of getting rid of the stones. Clos de Vougeot, again, I do want to point out, if you can see the label, it's Joseph Drouhin, who is now investing heavily in Oregon. And that is you know, a very, very fine bottle of that he has produced from Clos de Vougeot. So let's see how prices work with this classification system. So the first bottle on the left there, Bouchard Père et Fille, Gevrey Saint-Bertin, it's simply grown in the village. There's no name of the vineyard. It's just one of the vineyards in the commune of Gevrey-Chambertin. So there it is, $70. And does that answer your question of why, you know, it's difficult to give you a list of cheap, good Bordeaux wines, Burgundy wines. I don't think such a list exists. They are, and the article I'm going to send you this evening from Vanity Fair partly explains that, because the Burgundy is a very small area. The wine growing area is very, very small, very limited, not like Bordeaux. And so these wines are rare. So, okay, just the Gevrey-Chambertin, $70 for a bottle. Now we move into a Premier Cru. That's $260 for a bottle. And then we move up into a Grand Cru, and we've got a few dollars left over from $6,000 for a bottle. Am I beginning to explain why we're drinking Anderson Valley this evening? So up to now, we've looked at Gevrey-Chambertin. Here is another commune, Vosne-Romanée, and it has 6 Grand Crus. Let me see if they're the dark ones. La Tâche, Richebourg, Romanée Saint-Vivant, Romanée Clos, Le Grand Cru, and La Romanée. Those are all Grand Crus, and the pale pink are Premier Crus. And the most powerful person, owner in Vosne-Romanée, owns a company. His company is called Domaine Romanée Conti. So here are some of his bottles. The La Tâche Grand Cru, that goes for about $5,000 a bottle. The Domaine La Romanée Conti Richebourg Grand Cru is just under $20,000 for a bottle. And if you want a Romanée Conti Grand Cru, you're going to get change from $35,000. Now, bear in mind, these are prices that you're going to get in auction houses or stores or in dealers. If you go to a restaurant and want a bottle of 2000 Romanée Conti Grand Cru, you probably pay twice the price, $70,000. Unbelievable. Now, if you look at the left bottle and the right bottle, they've both got on them on the neck monopole. We're going to discuss that in just a moment, what that means. But first of all, let's meet Aubert de Villaine. Aubert de Villaine, probably one of the most respected wine growers in France. I've got it. I think he might have died just recently. If not, he's definitely up there. He was one of the judges in the famous 1976 Judgment of Paris. He actually voted for Stag's Leap, and none of his wines were included in the competition. Highly respected, and he has, as you can see here in this list, 5 Grand Crus and 2 Premier Crus that he owns. His labels are always very, very distinctive. And as you can see, the 2 here have got that thing around the neck, meaning they're a monopole. Now, he was in business, and by the way, the article I'm going to send you this evening about the blackmail attempt on the vineyard, he was the supposed victim. He was the target, just because he's probably, Romanée Conti is probably the most expensive and sought after wine in the world. and they're very, very limited. You might think, oh gosh, Patrick's told me all about this, and tomorrow morning you find out that you've won the lottery and you've got $1 million. I'm going to go and buy a bottle of just to celebrate. No, you won't, because it's not just a matter of money. What you can do is you can try and put your name on a list so that your grandchild might be included in being able to buy a bottle of Romani Conti. I mean, these things are so rare, so sought after. Just having the money to pay for it isn't enough. Again, the article I'm going to send you this evening will make all this a little bit clearer. Now, Aubert de Villaine had a partner for many years, and her name is Lalou. But they had a breaking up because Lalou was a bit naughty, and Aubert felt that she was cheapening the brand, and she was doing all sorts of hokey. We're talking, as you can see, big money here. We're talking about auctions in Hong Kong and New York, and it's big, high-level money talk. And she was a little bit fast and loose, so they broke up. And there was never a romantic relationship between them. I think she was the daughter of one of his original partners, but they broke up business-wise, and they're now competitors. Those are three of her more famous brands. So let's look here. They've both got a bunch of Grand Crus, as you can see, all different. But if you look at the blue ones, Domaine Leroy Richebourg Grand Cru, and with Aubert, you look down and you see Domaine Romani Conti Richebourg Grand Cru. What is this, you ask? They've both got Richebourg Grand Cru. And the reason is, this is the AOC, this is the actual vineyard Richebourg Grand Cru. And the different colors denote different owners. So I've put in arrows to show, so for example, Domaine Romani Conti, which is Aubert, Aubry, he has 3 tracts within the AOC. Labou, she has 2. Hers are yellow, his are green. And then you've got all the other people, all the different, the other colors are other people. And again, going back to French inheritance laws, as opposed to English inheritance laws where the eldest son, which is me, I'm the eldest of 6, gets everything. In France, me being the eldest of 6, I would have to split everything with my brothers and sisters equally. Consequently, if our parents were vineyard owners, we would all have certain tracts. Now, I might sell mine to my sister and she would manage it, or we might all get together as a bunch of brothers and sisters and sell it to Leroy or Domaine Romani Conti, or we'd all hoe our own little bit and collect our own wines, and then we would sell those to a négociant. And that's why you have négociants. I would imagine that some of the smaller areas we see here in this Richebourg would sell their grapes. They grow them themselves, but they sell their grapes to somebody like Louis Jadot, who would then bottle them as a négociant and call it Richebourg Grand Cru, but it would have the Louis Jadot name on the label rather than whoever actually grew the grapes. That's how it works, and that's how most. Here's another example. This is further south. This is in the Côte de Beaune, the village of Montrachet, Chassenay-Montrachet. Again, I don't know how. Hopefully, when you've got these at home, you'll be able to see that some of these plots are owned by. It's called DRC, Domaine Romani Conti, and another one is by Romani Conti. So he owns certain tracts there, and that means he can, as the label, you can see the label there, Montrachet, that's very much a domain, and it's selling for just over $8,000 a bottle. These are extraordinary prices. I mean, sit and think about it. We've opened a bottle of wine and $8,000. It's no bigger than this one. And there was the one we saw before, $34,000. Now we come to monopole. If you remember last week, I mentioned Francois Picot. He owns Yves Saint Laurent and Bouchard, and he owns Chateau Latour. He's a very, very wealthy man, and he's now got into collecting monopoles. A monopole is when you have an AOC, an Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée area, and one person owns it. Let's go back to this is a typical AOC, Appellation Contrôlée vineyard. It's owned by, what have we got there? 10, 12 different people. They all own different bits of it. But a monopole is when one person owns it all. So Aubry de Villain, he owns La Tâche and Romanée Conti. Owns them outright. Nobody else can can get any fines from that area. And this man, Francois Picot, he owns, as I mentioned last week, he owns, if you remember, the Northern Rhone, the white wine, Chateau Brillet. He bought that as a monopole. He owns Clos de Tar. He's obviously collecting monopoles. That's if any of you are super rich, that's the next hip thing to do. Forget about yachts, forget about fancy cars. It's monopoles. That's what I'm after next. So to summarize, the difference between Bordeaux and Burgundy. The Bordeaux, as we looked at last week, it's the largest fine wine region in the world, as opposed to Burgundy, which is relatively small, dominated by large chateaus, many of which are owned by Hong Kong banks and Midwestern insurance companies. Big money. There's 6 different grapes which have been permitted, and they each and the reputation is built on specific tastes. So, for example, a Chateau Latour will always taste and the man who's blending those 6 grapes, his job is to blend them in such a way that somebody can taste it and say, this is a Chateau Latour from the blend of the grapes. And it's not a Chateau Lafite, or it's not a Chateau Mouton. And that's what they do with the blending the grapes. It was developed very much, not for the French, for the English taste. It's more austere, many more tannins, originally simply because in order to travel, the tannins helped it to age. And because of the tannins, you can't drink it straight away, you need to let it age. Austere and refined, like the English. Now the Burgundy, much smaller areas, as I've said, as I indicated, most Burgundy vineyards are owned by people who don't have enough vines to make their own wine in their own winery. People, the 2 we've just looked at are exceptions. Most Burgundy farmers are, they grow their grapes and then they sell them to the negociant, and the negociant will bottle them, Louis Jadot, for example, and they will put their labels on. Small individual farmers, and there's only one grape, Pinot Noir, for red wines, and Chardonnay for the white wines. Developed very much for the French taste, as opposed to being austere and thoughtful. It's much more earthy, much more immediate, much more fruity. So let me unmute you. Oh, it looks like you're all unmuted. Are we unmuted? So I'm going to, unless you have any questions, I'm going to send you all these PowerPoint slides, plus the assassin in the vineyard, the blackmail attempt on Aubry de Villain, and 2 wonderful, wonderful videos which you can watch while you're finishing off your bottle of wine. Any questions?
Brief,
Young Mario there, yes.
Yeah. And pardon me.
I think it's
But what about the status of white wines? I know we haven't really been talking about much about them much. Is that are white wines not as chapter because it's less complexity, or why don't we talk about white wines as much?
Well, that's a good question, and my wife Jude actually asked the same thing. We've only got, this is only a 6-hour course, so we can't, there's tons of stuff we can't cover. So that's why I just focused on the great reds of France. I mean, we could then talk about great reds elsewhere. The real answer to your question is yes, white wines are less complex, partly because they don't age as well. Some Chardonnays do, some Rieslings do, but on the whole, they're much more immediate. So after the 1976 tasting, when the French were all upset about the Californians winning, when they redid the test, the experiment 10 years later, and then again 30 years later, they only did it with the red wines because white wines don't last that long. However, because a very good idea, Mario, and my wife Jude suggested, she had the same question. So what I might do at some stage is do another class, not a 6-hour class like this, but maybe just a 1 hour devoted to white wines. And then we can talk about all the different grape varietals and the history, but they are less, there's less to say about white wines. There's not enough to make it a 6-hour course. Any other questions?
Would be good.
Okay.
Maybe a 3-hour course. Yeah, 3 would be fine.
Another question. Sorry, you mentioned that they sort of had a return of the judgment of Paris, so to speak. Were those results consistent in time?
Yes, and in fact, I believe I sent you
Well, he hit
I
that
sent you a Wikipedia account of it all with enormous details of
Champagne was moving to England.
with the results and everything.
And that they were worried
Did you
about
not get that?
the fact that they'll be able to grow wines like Syrah, where they're now growing.
I don't believe so, but
That's all.
I'm not very good at keeping up with my emails.
Then I will send it again to you.
I tend to cram right before an exam, and I didn't do my homework apparently.
I should never have let you marry my daughter.
That is that matter.
Okay, any other questions? Because I'm sorry I've gone over my time, and I hope I'm not keeping you from your dinner.
Patrick, can I ask a quick question?
Where is Dylan?
Well, my dinner was the wine, but so I did get the Oregon Pinot Noir, and it came with a screw top. Does that mean anything? Cork versus screw
No,
top?
that's a good question. The original question where I started the evening is, do wines age in a bottle? As I said, 99% of wines today, sorry, 95%, are made to be drunk immediately. They don't put them out into the market till they're ready to drink, just because that's the modern taste, and that's the variety of reasons for that. With wine, we want, while it's in the bottle, we want to make sure that the oxygen doesn't get to it. And the most efficient way of keeping oxygen away from the wine is...
Well, I had a lot of them.
The most efficient way of keeping oxygen out of the wine is a screw top bottle. They are more efficient than corks.
This was screw top.
However, going back to the original question about bottles that you're going to keep for 30 or 40 years.
We're joking. I'm trying to prepare.
See if we can mute. Bottles that you're trying to keep for 20 or 30 years.
It's Salida. Salida, mute Salida. Mute Salida.
Mute.
Those two ladies are getting
We're getting kind of carried away.
That's Salida and Anne. I know them.
So let's leave it till next week. You're going to enjoy the email I'm about to send you. That will keep you all busy while you finish off the rest of the bottle. And cheers, everybody.
Dude, teacher's pet. You ratted them out.
And you. How do I, there we go. Oh, there's everybody. I'm sorry, I should have closed that down. Oh, how nice to see you all. I've been sitting here all by myself all this time. Oh, and
Thank you.
And Mike Moore in that lovely Burgundy chateau in the vineyard. How nice. Cheers, everyone. Oh, by the way, did we like this?
Thank you, Patrick. It was great.
It was great.
Very different from the previous ones.
Thank you, Patrick.
And next week is going to be the absolute opposite of this. It's going to be a big, oh, who had the cheese? Did anybody get cheese from Anderson Valley? Goat's cheese?
Goat cheese.
It's hard to find.
We had goat cheese, but not from the valley. I couldn't find it.
No, it is difficult to find.
What a nice background. Oh.
I had a Humboldt Fog goat cheese, aged goat cheese with the ash in it.
And how did it go?
It was really good. Tasted like goat cheese, but with a little bit of that brie, ashy taste to it.
Just needs a little drop of Pinot Noir. And
hey, Patrick, it's Mike Moore. My wife just came in from work to join us. We had I couldn't find the brand you wanted, but we used a Ferrari Carano Pinot from Anderson Valley. It worked out very nice.
You got a what?
Ferrari Carano from Anderson Valley, Pinot Noir.
As I explained earlier on, I was actually wanting an Oregon. But Northern California, Oregon, that's the New World equivalent of the Burgundy wines. So don't worry. I didn't pick this brand specifically. I was just picking the region. That's why I made the choice.
Well, it's delicious. The region.
Yeah, that's the same. That's the same one we got.
That's the one. That's exactly the same bottle we got. It was awesome.
Isn't it good?
We thought it was great.
Yeah, it was great.
It is delicious. I wish I'd been here earlier.
Possibly the best we've had, of course.
I have another.
I got a third of a glass here. Okay.
See you all next
There you
Wednesday.
go.
Have a wonderful week.
Okay.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Great job, Patrick.
Thank you.